Thank you. I'm Marie Abrams from Louisville, Kentucky, and I have the honor of chairing and initiating and framing this morning's very important discussion. JCPA, as you know, is a unique partnership of local and national agencies. We are a family, the only one where the four religious movements come together on common issues, both domestic and international. Our process goes to great length to ensure that our policies reflect true consensus. It takes 5 agencies to sponsor a resolution, and we allow abstentions, dissents, and for the religious streams, a veto. Plus, there are mechanisms to send a resolution back to a task force for more consideration. 5 months ago, the Louisville CRC, yay, adopted a resolution calling for the JCPA to endorse same-sex marriage. The JSBOR, that's Jewish Security and Bill of Rights, task force moved a resolution similar but slightly different, opposing discrimination against same-sex couples. Last month, the JCPA Resolutions Committee, after a great deal of conversation and discussion, returned that resolution to the task force for more deliberation. They did so because at least one JCPA member agency, the Orthodox Union, felt that it was not an issue that the JCPA should consider at this time. The topic of this morning's panel is consensus and controversy, and we are using this resolution as a case study to discuss how even when there are deep disagreements, as a family, we engage in honest and respectful conversation, striving to learn from one another on a complex topic, all the while building and maintaining shalom bayit, peace in the house. And by the way, I loved, for those of you who were in here the last session, the conversation about the one young woman who loved all the meanings of the word shalom. So in this case, when we say shalom bayit, I think we can adopt some of what she found so moving and meaningful about the word shalom. So we try to maintain shalom bayit, and to maintain that peace, please turn off your cell phones and listen up. Here to help us navigate this topic are 4 of the smartest people we know. We have further bios in the program, so I'm giving you 3 lines about each one so that we can let them have the time to talk. Our first panelist and the moderator is Amy Jill Levine, she will be the moderator, I just said that. She is a self-described Yankee Orthodox Jewish feminist who teaches New Testament in the Bible Belt. She teaches at Vanderbilt Divinity School and at Cambridge. Ronnie and I, you know, Amy Jill met at Vanderbilt. Hey. She is the author of The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, and the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Jeremy Burton is the executive director of the Boston JCRC. He has also worked for Jewish Funds for Justice and the Jewish Funders Network. And New York Mayor David Dinkins and Manhattan Borough President Ruth Messenger. He is a yeshiva bocher and now serves on the boards of Keshet, working for the full inclusion of LGBT, you know, this is not as easy to read as it looks, for the full inclusion of LGBT Jews in Jewish life, and Eshel, which supports LGBT people in traditional Jewish communities. The JTA listed him among the most 100 influential Jewish voices on Twitter. Yehuda Neuberger of Baltimore is the lay chair of the Institute for Public Affairs, the political and policy arm of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America, the OU. He is a graduate of Ner Israel Rabbinical College, Johns Hopkins University, and Harvard Law School. He is a private equity investor and has served in leadership roles with AIPAC and the Associated, which is the Jewish Federation of Baltimore. And Rabbi David Saperstein directs the Religious Action Center for Reformed Judaism. Newsweek has listed him as the most influential rabbi in the country, and the Washington Post called him the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill. He has served on the boards of the NAACP, People for the American Way, and COJAL, and President Obama appointed him to the first White House Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He teaches First Amendment church-state law and Jewish law at Georgetown Law School. Dr. Levine.
Good morning. Just a brief correction. I am a member of an Orthodox shul, although the level of my orthodoxy is not terribly high. To contextualize this, because this is a conversation that members of the Jewish community within and with the OU have been having for a while. Here's a brief background. On February 20th, 2012, my rabbi, Saul Strasberg, from Congregation Shereth Israel in Nashville, Tennessee, and I wrote the following letter, we sent it by email on hard copy, to Stephen Berg and Stephen Weil of the OU, and it reads as follows. Dear Rabbi Berg and Rabbi Weil, the Institute for Public Affairs of the Orthodox Union published on February 8th, this is a year ago, 5 things you need to know, a pre-Shabbat email roundup for rabbis. Along with comments on the religious exemption for healthcare reform, report on Iran, and notices of primary results, the list asserts, quote, the OU-IPA is disappointed that the Ninth Circuit Federal Court struck down California's Proposition 8, which would have prohibited same-sex marriage. This past week, a similar statement was issued regarding gay marriage in New Jersey. We understand the OU's position of same-sex marriage as being contrary to halakha. However, we reject the OU's attempt to impose its religious views on the citizens of California. Jews have a long and tragic history of living in countries where the majority religion, be it Christianity or Islam, imposed its values on us. We should have learned from this history that it is inappropriate to ask or even expect non-Jews to subscribe to our halakhic decisions. And this was signed by myself and my rabbi. We did receive a response from Stephen Berg. Thank you for reaching out. I asked Nathan Diamond, who is in the room here today, the executive director of the OU Institute for Public Affairs, to answer your question below. Thank you for asking in such a respectful manner. Here's the response we received. The OU is not seeking to impose, quote unquote, our halakhic views on American society at large. The OU, representing many thousands of Orthodox Jews, is, like millions of other Americans who, for a variety of reasons, oppose legal recognition of same-sex marriage, voicing our perspective as American citizens on this critical issue. We voice this view within the context of the American democratic process and are thus, by definition, not imposing, quote unquote, anything on anybody. And I thank Nathan for giving me his permission to read that this morning. My rabbi and I wrote back and suggested as follows. We appreciate your quick response. Concerns, however, stem from the idea that the prohibition against homosexuality is a religious prohibition, like eating treif. To that end, I'm cutting some material here. Why would we as Jews feel the need to push those values on non-Jews in our society? Again, thank you for letting us know where you stand. As a follow-up to this, Rabbi Weil invited Rabbi Strasberg, my rabbi, and myself to come to New York to talk with the OU about these matters, which we thought was fabulous. My rabbi was unable to take the meeting because of a death in the congregation. So I went down. I was worried my skirt was not long enough. I went down to OU headquarters and met with Rabbi Weil. We had an hour-and-a-half conversation. He began by saying, this is off the record. I said, fine. I found it an extraordinarily productive conversation. At the end, I said, can I report what we talked about? He said, no, this is part of an ongoing conversation. I said, can I report that we met knowing where I stand on questions of gay rights? He said, absolutely. So this is the beginning of a conversation ongoing within the broader Jewish community. Here to help us continue that conversation are my three colleagues. We have not decided on who would start, so it's up to you, gentlemen, as to where you'd like to begin. Be brave.
What's the question?
What's the question?
Questions. How do we proceed on this? How do we establish Shalom Bayit in the broader community? Why the OU decided that this was not the right time, the right place, or they being, the JCPA being the right group at this time to bring forward such a resolution. Where do we go from here?
If that's a frame, I would suggest, Yehuda, then it might make sense for you to lead us off.
Okay, thank you. I would just make a prefatory remark. So as the notice of this session went out that I would be speaking on this topic in this forum, I got some emails and calls from friends who said, you're going where to discuss what? And I did tell them, and I believe I've, in my experience of dealing with various things at JCPA, I've found nothing but respectful and honest and candid dialogue. And I saw that happening here as well. And in fact, as was mentioned in the introduction, there are a few forums where we really have an opportunity as a broad community to get together and discuss topics of importance, and therefore I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be with my co-panelists. I think really in the introduction you raised, there is one set of questions and another set of questions relating to the particular topic here today. I think the one here today is a bit easier to address from the perspective of the OU, and I should also clarify, technically I am speaking in a personal capacity for a variety of reasons, as there are discussions ongoing in the OU, and I'll try and give a bit of sense, but really speaking in my own opinions. But as it relates to this particular topic, the issue that the OU has and is raised in this particular context is not so much a question on any bill in particular on gay marriage. It's a question as to whether the JCPA ought to be engaging and supporting the concept of gay marriage. I know that in the particular resolution it was taken out, but the context is there because this is an organization of which we're a proud member. I think that ultimately there was a lot of questions, should we dissent, vote against? The feeling was, as an organization that we belong to, it would be problematic for us to be part of an organization that was actively advocating for gay marriage, which, in the traditional Orthodox viewpoint, is problematic. So in particular, the request we had to JCPA was that this should not be a resolution topic here in this context. I think I recognize that many people in this room and throughout the country who are Jews and who are very sincere in their convictions actually see support for gay marriage as a Jewish cause and a Jewish topic. And while I might disagree, I respect that viewpoint. The argument simply is that there are a few forums where we can really get together as a group and participate in dialogue. And for this particular organization that represents a consensus view, represents across the four streams of Judaism, that we felt it was an inappropriate topic given the dividing nature of it and the manner in which it would affect our constituency. So I think framing it, that's the particular issue for today. I would love at some point, I give my co-panelists a chance to speak a bit, but would be happy to address more particularly some of the calculus that goes through our minds as we think about what do we or don't we make statements on. And I think even since the time that you had that exchange, there have been some evolutions of thinking as well, and I'm happy to address that. But I'll start with that as a basic introduction.
I'll go down the line. That's excellent. I want to pull this back and not have a conversation about the Orthodox Union, and rather have a conversation about the JCPA. So Marie described the resolution from Louisville and the way in which the commission changed the resolution from a civil marriage equality to a same-sex relationships resolution. And when our CRC, as so many of the CRCs around the country, got that resolution and engaged with it as a local community, we decided to oppose it here. And had it been brought to a vote tonight, we would have voted no. And based on the consultations we had with others, we know that other CRCs and some of the national agencies here would have voted against it as well. And the reason we would have voted against it is because it didn't endorse civil marriage equality. And I want to start being precise about the word civil marriage equality, not marriage equality. Our CRC 8 years ago, when Massachusetts was first in the nation to consider civil marriage equality, went through a vigorous debate. And my predecessor, Nancy Kaufman, and the chair at the time, Susan Kalishman, recognized that the vast majority of our community, like the vast majority of American Jews, support civil marriage equality. Today, in every poll, consistently of American Jews, over 80% support civil marriage equality. But and we have different rules from here, the movements do not have a veto, did not want to have a position as a local community that forced one movement or others to walk away from our table. And so the process by which we wrote our resolution supporting civil marriage equality in Massachusetts was actually to invite leaders of our Orthodox movement and Orthodox rabbis on our council to write a resolution on civil marriage equality that they could vote no against or maybe abstain, but did not feel the need to walk away from the table over. And so we have been proudly supportive of civil marriage equality for 8 years, and we read this resolution and said, this is a step back. This is not marriage equality. This is about same-sex relationships. And that the resolution that was circulated to our field in the last couple of months left the door open for civil unions, left the door open for something less than an endorsement of marriage equality. So I would like to frame this in the context of, and get into in greater detail, what is the distinction between personally as someone who does not believe in religious marriage equality for myself and civil marriage equality, which I aspire to. I want to get back to the place of what it means for JCPA to be an organization that is a representative body of the American Jewish community and the organized community that takes positions on everything under the sun and stands for everything and is unable to find a consensus on this issue, which is the most pressing civil rights issue of our time. I think that is the conversation that we are trying to have as a community here today, and hopefully in the coming months to have some movement on this issue as a body.
So a few points. First, I appreciated Marie's introduction about 4 of the smartest people in the room. It certainly is true of my 3 colleagues here, but looking out in the audience, I am inclined, invoking Kennedy, to say, yeah, we may be amongst the smartest people in the room since the last time Label Fine dined alone. Here. Secondly, just a comment on the exchange of letters that you had, because I actually differ with both sides of this. Nathan, also one of the smartest people I know, here, the notion that because you've put an idea out for debate in the free marketplace of ideas, it has any impact whatsoever on the question of whether you're trying to establish religion or impose religion on anyone, I just don't even begin to understand. In other words, if I put out a proposal saying that I want to pass a law in America that everyone has to observe kashrut or everyone has to go once a month to a mosque, here, clearly we're imposing religion, but it's out in the free market place of ideas. It has to do with what the intrinsic idea is. Having said that, I agree with Nathan, however, that this is not establishment of religion, if that's what your letters were trying to convey. The constitutional test under the Lemon test is that it has to be any reasonable secular purpose for a law. We can debate over how valid those secular purposes are, but I certainly think that credible secular purposes that can be made for someone who wants to restrict marriage to heterosexual marriage. I mean, I think they're wrong. Deeply, profoundly believe they're wrong, but that's a different issue. I feel the same way about people who say the Catholic Church is trying to establish religion by arguing about abortion. I think there are clearly secular reasons for a different stance in Roe v. Wade on abortion that one can make, and that passes the test. No different than when David Saperstein stands up and argues You know, God's called us to, the lesson of Noah is that God calls us to be guardian, shomrim, of God's creation, and therefore we need an Endangered Species Act. Or when JCPA stands up and says our religious tradition mandates that we fight in America for care for the poor and feeding the hungry and housing the homeless, sheltering the homeless, that's establishing a religion. It's offering a moral frame for an argument that has a secular justification. I think it's more stretched on the marriage issue because of the intrinsic religious character of the history of marriage in other places. I still don't think it rises to the level of establishment of religion. I am curious, look, my position simply is this. There is no more important civil rights issue of this moment in history. For the Jewish community, an umbrella group like JCPA, to be silent on such an issue is a tremendous loss. It's a tremendous loss to the discourse of America. It's a tremendous loss to those who have been allies for us in the civil rights world, who have mobilized on this issue, have supported us in terms of our fight for our fundamental rights. The issue of civil rights, fundamental civil rights, is an indivisible one. If any group can be persecuted or oppressed or discriminated against, it endangers everyone's protection of civil rights and civil liberties. I think to say that this applies at this period of time. And when it is so self-evident that the overwhelming number of Jews, as you indicated in the PRRI poll, the most recent large poll on this, 81% of American Jews support gay marriage, way higher than the American populace as a whole. I don't know, others may be able to tell me how the vote was shaping up amongst people. My question to you is, what does it mean divided? Here. So here, that we shouldn't take a position on which we are so divided. We're not sure exactly what that means and what the test you're proposing would be. You indicated you might want to go into that, and I'd love to hear more about your thinking on this. No one feels more strongly than I do that the Orthodox Union or any other group has a right to express their views in opposition to this here. And you also have a right to veto here. You also have a right to leave a coalition with which you disagree. I'm puzzled by why this would be the case. In other words, the OU's position, as I understand it, while it doesn't agree with a Catholic position on abortion, also is not based on Roe v. Wade here, and yet you allow us to support Roe v. Wade. I would suspect that there are issues sometimes of important principle that a lot of groups differ with in terms of what we do here. It's rare for us to try and stop the system. It was aimed to do it on the issues of the most fundamental principle. For you to have visibly abstained on it or voted against it here, we don't actually have a formal thing about registering a dissent that could have been negotiated in a situation like this. I mean, but to actually stop the process when there is such an overwhelming consensus really was, to me, a puzzling act on an issue that so many feel is an issue of course, civil rights. So I think trying to explore what the demarcation points are, what the standards ought to be about when that veto is evoked, how this differs from other kinds of issues, would be an extraordinarily helpful thing to do. I respectfully think that the OU made the wrong decision on this here, but I absolutely support your right to do it. And once you made it here, I was one of those that felt, at this moment, I don't want to end up with the OU leaving the organization. I don't want to have a split vote, because if you were going to veto it, others might have voted on a process question, and it would have obscured the way the vote came out, and I had concerns about doing it. I'm glad we withheld and had this conversation now, but at some point, our community has to be on record in terms of the umbrella organizations on this issue, and I hope we can persuade you folks that next year we should move ahead expeditiously on this.
Just so we're all on the same page here, and this may be better for Jeremy to ask, can you actually talk about where we are in the process since the resolution as formulated was actually sent back to committee?
That's where we are in the process.
But can you talk about how that works?
The resolutions committee, I guess, and this is my first year on the resolutions committee, we voted essentially to table it based on an assessment of, and as is noted, many complicated conversations and really a very deep respect for the table, which is part of this conversation, recognize that there was no resolution on the issue of civil marriage equality or same-sex relationships, depending on what you were a proponent of, that was going to both pass tonight and survive a veto. And there have been times in the past, my understanding, and I have recollection of them, where issues related particularly to civil liberties of gay and lesbian Americans, like in the military, reached the floor here and were vetoed. And that resulted in this body not taking a position on those issues for many, many years, frankly, long after the vetoing organizations had changed their positions on that issue. So it was the judgment with the council, the staff of the resolutions committee that at this time, rather than have a divisive vote that resulted in defeat, and rather than force any organization at the table to take a principled step away from the table, it was better to continue the conversation. I would say, as one CRC, the resolutions process in and of itself doesn't really allow us to engage as a full community around these topics leading up to the votes tonight. There are certainly offline conversations. We reach out to some of the national organizations and some of the CRCs that we work closely with, but all of us don't sit in a room and have this conversation. And so it is hopeful, maybe, and I think the aspiration of at least having a conversation here rather than a vote is to move this into a public conversation that allows us to find a way forward. I do think my question, and I really don't feel that this is about, I don't want this to be about the OU, I want this to be about JCPA. But for those at this table who would choose to veto a resolution if it had been brought to the floor tonight, knowing that process, knowing the intentionality of withdrawing the resolution and putting it back in committee, knowing that some of the CRCs, like ourselves, that would not have supported this watered-down civil equality resolution. And by the way, we chose, and we debated it vociferously, and I have many, many board members who are not happy. We chose not to bring a same-sex marriage, civil marriage resolution forward this year, because we chose as one community, said we don't want to call the question. We as one community don't want to actually force the OU to veto something that we knew the OU was going to veto. So I think the question I would turn around to those who are opposed to civil marriage equality and to those at this table who are not ready to go where 80% plus of American Jews are, and recognizing the nature of this body as a voice across a range of issues, how do we move forward? What is the resolution that you can sit on your veto? What is the resolution that would allow you to say we dissent, but we recognize the will of the vast majority? How can we find a respectful place in a family that consensus is not an absolute 100%, but rather there is a consensus that this respects the will of the vast majority? And what is the next resolution going to look like? It could have been possible to do something more narrow. That would be explicitly only about this body supports the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act. That might have been a more narrow resolution, and it might have been more progress than we have today. But here we sit with the most important civil rights issue of our time, and as far as I can recall, despite the fact that we take positions on everything under the sun, from fracking to gun control to data collection in public schools, we are possibly for the first time in the history of JCPA farther back than the sitting president of the United States on a major civil rights issue. And that's something we need to think about.
Yehuda?
Okay, there's a lot of questions in all of that. I'll try to address some of them. I think, I would state as, again, just setting a bit of background. So I read an article came out in the last couple of weeks from a professor at Harvard, Michael Klarman, and he talks about how it went from, the dramatic shift from homosexual sex being a criminal act in all states 50 years ago to where you now have many states having gay marriage. And he's, outlined the history of it, but also spoke a little bit about its causes and how it shifted so dramatically. And he points to the fact that more and more people know someone who's gay, was number one, and number two, amongst the youth, that people are overwhelmingly in favor of this, far beyond even others within the community, and that's nationally. So it shows, that was really the factors that precipitated this shift. in some fashion, we're seeing those same factors in the Orthodox community. You have an increasing number of people in the Orthodox community who have come out that they are gay. You have more and more people who know someone who's gay, and you also find this with young people, that they're far more sympathetic to the cause, the civil rights, the gay marriage. And in fact, one of the OU's programs is JLIC, which is on campus and services many Orthodox students on campus, others as well. And they've reported to me, they say this is one of the most difficult issues that they encounter, is that the young people, they recognize the Torah prohibition as understood in the Orthodox view on homosexual sex. They understand that, they're not contesting that, but it makes them uncomfortable that their organizations that represent them have been coming out against gay marriage and other things of that nature. And I say that because it's something we're aware of. It's an issue we're grappling with. It's not something we're trying to ignore. And in fact, in the history of how we got engaged in this very topic, when we started, our feeling was that we almost felt that we would need to resign from the JCPA rather than issue a veto. And the reason being is we felt that we didn't want to be the organization. We understand the deeply held conviction of many people who have a different viewpoint than us, and we didn't necessarily want to be in the position of issuing a veto and all of the things attendant to that, and we honestly and sincerely thought about resigning from the organization. And that's the series of conversations that we had with Rabbi Gutta and with Ethan, and they encouraged us. Actually, they said there's a reason that the veto's there. The veto's there so that you have the opportunity to present your view, to engage in conversation, and then to veto it. And we spoke about that, we thought about that, and I think many of us were convinced by that perhaps that was the best approach. But at the end of the day, I think that the reason we came out where we did and we asked that the resolution be tabled is because this very issue, there is no ambiguity in the mainstream Orthodox community about the prohibition on homosexual sex. There are other issues that come up that entail more of a balancing. And so the question is, as we balance, how much flexibility do we have to be cognizant of the feelings and issues of members of the Orthodox community who are gay, others who are advocates for this cause throughout the community? And, once upon a time I might have thought that if someone wrote a book on the Orthodox view of homosexuality, it would be the shortest book ever published. But it's not true. There's complexity, there are issues, there are things that come up on a regular basis, and I think as an organization, we want to do our best to be sensitive to that, to balance it, but while all that time retaining fidelity to our understanding of halakha, and also to the fact that as in many areas, but particularly in Orthodox Judaism, there's a notion that the Torah represents a moral body and an ethical body, and we try to abide by that. So for example, on the very question you raised about coming out against gay marriage, and again, I'm speaking personally because I don't think the OU as an organization has made a determination on this. But when I think about, and Rabbi Saperstein said it, and I agree, there's all sorts of things that we could say. We see the Torah as an ethical body, and therefore perhaps we should advocate for capital punishment for people who hit their parents or curse them. We don't, because that's a clearly religious issue. There are other things, as you mentioned, which we just can pull from a religious source and give it a basis to another argument. But I think the area where religion has a place and where in the past we've spoken out is not because we think that religious law or Jewish law should dictate what happens in secular law, but rather there's a whole category of areas I think that most people would acknowledge. At some level, our country was founded on Judeo-Christian ethics. They might not have been religious per se. There's religious ethical norms. And over the course of time, some of those have been challenged, and the status quo is being challenged. And I think where something has its basis, if not in religion, but at least in religious-like issues, that it's important to speak out during that debate to retain the role that we see coming from religion as being an ethical issue. And so that's where I think historically we've spoken up, and I could point to examples where I think, there's a lot of different examples, different way, but I was thinking about this yesterday. You could look at like assisted suicide, when you had Jack Kevorkian doing his things. The concept of sanctity of life is a religious ethical concept. In other words, you could think about society that has no place for religion and they will be opposed to murder. That's understandable. But if someone wants to take their own life, the notion of a sanctity of life is really a religious ethical concept of some sort. It has its basis in that, I think. And I think as a country, the country wasn't ready to go there, and the argument carried the day by and large. On this particular topic, so what happens is I feel that there's a place for religious viewpoint in a secular debate, particularly where there's an underlying origin and basis. What happens is, over the course of time, if society sufficiently repudiates the place for religion in a particular topic, as in some fashion is happening here in this particular issue, there's less of a place in that public debate for the religious viewpoint. That being said, there still remains a reason that we might speak up, which is simply that sometimes there are many things in our popular culture that we feel erode at a moral and ethical framework that we understand, and therefore sometimes even if the country is shifting a certain way, we might wish to speak out simply because we think it's good to take that moral stand. I think that's where balancing comes into play. In other words, so it's no longer a strict halachic question. It's something where society by and large has moved on. I think you could look at, once upon a time there were laws about adultery and it was criminal. Those laws were changed. People don't make a big deal about it because society has moved on and doesn't see that as the basis for determination. So I think what you have is you have circumstances where there is and needs to be sensitivity. And I think on questions like this, balancing, do we speak out when there is a gay marriage act or passage? And I think there are many within the Orthodox community who would argue that we should not. That being said, I feel that when we talk about something like, if we are going to straddle a line and we're going to be careful about a balance, we have to be extra careful about not sending a message or not doing something that in any fashion dilutes our understanding of the Torah view and the halachic view. And I think that in particular is what's going on here at the JCPA, because the notion, we thought about dissenting strongly, we thought about voting against. The concern was, and I have absolute confidence in the JCPA that if in fact we wanted it to be in the resolution, and they would put our dissent in the resolution and it would be public, and I could also have great confidence that all of the press releases coming out of JCPA would reflect the fact that we contested it or were opposed. But at the end of the day, JCPA would be taking a step. It would be saying we support, whether it's civil gay marriage, whether it's some lesser rights, whatever it is, that as an organization we're taking that view, and the Orthodox Union is a proud member of that organization. So what happens is the message gets lost, and the concern that we had was that for the very reason that I think we were trying to be sensitive, in other words, if we weren't sensitive to these issues, we could have come here to the resolution session tonight, gotten up, given a fire and brimstone speech, lectured everyone about our view of morality, vetoed the resolution, and walked out. We didn't, and we didn't want to, because that's not our goal. I think there really is a genuine effort to be sensitive to the issues of people within our community, within the broader Jewish community, but just simply that feeling, we felt that as we're being sensitive, as we're being careful, as we're making a balance, that there are certain lines we need to draw, and being associated and affiliated with an organization that's actively promoting resolution and therefore legislation and other actions that promote gay marriage was something that concerned us and that we felt that we needed to speak out against.
As you go through, you might, for a future conversation, which we certainly will have, want to help some of us who don't quite function in your worldview understand how this is, quote unquote, an ethical issue rather than a ritual issue. And for me, equating two people who want to have civil rights together with adultery or capital punishment, where people actually do get hurt, that strikes me as a category confusion. So if you want to make an argument that two people want to commit together, that's an ethical violation, it would be helpful to know what specific ethic, as opposed to ritual, is being violated there. So that's something that we might want to continue.
I'm happy to address it. I saw Rabbi Saperstein seem to.
Yeah.
David.
No, go ahead.
I want to say this very respectfully, but the way in which...
There's always a but when someone begins that way.
We're not talking about sex. We're not talking about gay sex. We're not talking about homosexual sex. We're talking about marriage. And those are different things, as probably more than enough of the people in this room know. Sex and marriage do not go together. on both sides of that equation. There is, and I want to say this not as a CRC director, because CRCs do not have official views on halachic issues, but I will say this personally. I view those very differently, and it's personal. I'll tell you, my parents, I think some of you know, my mother is a convert to Judaism. She was a graduate student at Berkeley in 1964, and she had already begun studying for conversion with the Orthodox Beit Din in Berkeley and San Francisco, and then she met my father, who was a secular, atheistic Jew, and they met on a picket line, and my father was interested in her and interested in her profound commitment to Orthodox Judaism, which was completely alien to him. And in his deciding to propose marriage to her and to marry her, he made a choice that he was going to embrace the Orthodox Judaism that she was pursuing. But this was 1965, and she had not yet completed her conversion, and it was still, because it was a very rigorous Orthodox Beit Din, a few-year-long process. It was also 1965, and as a traditional Catholic Mexican girl, she knew the difference between sex and marriage, or they had a different notion about it in those days. So they got a civil marriage at Oakland City Hall in the spring of 1965, and they had a celebration in my grandparents' living room. And then a year later, when the Beit Din finished its process, and she converted as an Orthodox Jew, they had a second marriage, a religious marriage, an Orthodox marriage. There is a distinction between civil marriage and religious marriage, and that is what we're talking about. There is a halachic view about homosexual sex, or at least one form of it. We're not going to get into that because there have been whole books written on it. That is different from the halachic approach, which I ascribe to, on Kiddushin and Nisuyin. We are talking about two different things, sex and marriage. And within the Orthodox approach to halacha, at this moment, the view that I hold, I think that several of us hold, is that there is no path forward for Kiddushin and Nisuyin to be extended beyond two people of opposite sex who are both, within an Orthodox context, halachically Jewish. There are lots of other marriages in this room. There are lots of other marriages that are legal under American law. There are a lot of other marriages that the Jewish community in this country supports and endorses and encourages, and that the OU and others stay at the communal table over. We are talking about Kiddushin and Nisuyin and the distinction between those of us who do not believe in a religious path forward for marriage equality, to separate that from society moving forward on civil marriage equality, and to stop, as a society, denying hundreds of rights and privileges to couples based on our sexual orientation.
Okay, I mean, I would respond to that by saying the following is, I absolutely acknowledge the distinction there. I think that what you have is, in particular, well, let me take a step back. I think the OU actually is governed by a series. The manner in which it's governed is there are resolutions that are adopted at conventions, and there is a resolution on gay marriage. It is opposed. The resolution does not address civil unions, and the organization has not come out and taken a position on it. I would simply observe that one of the things, the conversations that I've heard over the course of time as people are grappling with this issue, is you do have more people in the community who support the concept of a civil union, simply because it could be for many reasons. People could choose to have a civil union for reasons entirely unrelated to anything romantic or sexual. There is the concept, and again, not speaking organizationally, but I hear that argument often. It's one that I think, as I discussed, as there's conversation, as there's question as to what can we support or not support, that's a very interesting topic of discussion. I think the notion, though, is that forgetting the arguments about sanctity of marriage or etc., in other words, that marriage has a certain connotation and concept. In fact, in Jewish law and halakha, one of the methods of consummating a marriage is through sex. So that is definitely an element, but according to some, that it's not a full and complete halachic marriage until there is sex. So in other words, the notion of taking gay marriage in particular is something that is very much intertwined in our view with homosexual sex. It's not to It's not to malign people or anything of that nature. It's simply saying that marriage and sex have a certain equivalence, and therefore adopting a position that's in favor of gay marriage would in essence be approving or condoning or in some fashion assigning, again, leaving aside the whole question of whether there's a sanctity of marriage. But in other words, there is that concept that you'd be complicit or involved in creating a mechanism whereby homosexual sex is expected and a part of that relationship. So I think we very much know that distinction. I think the interesting conversation, and over the course of years, it remains to be seen. I think there's some level to which there are red lines in community. And I don't know necessarily where they develop. There are certain ones. Shabbat in Orthodox view that one actually goes back to the Talmud, talking about that as a certain red line. I think others are societal. So 20 years ago, surely in the Orthodox community, but really in the broader Jewish community, intermarriage was a red line. Maybe you have to go back a little more than 20 years ago. There surely was some period of time to which, that was simply a red line that people didn't cross, and if you did, you were outside of the community in some fashion. That's changed. Maybe this will change too. Maybe over the course of time, people will simply not see this as a red line. That's very possible. But at the moment, I think that in Orthodox Jewish life, that is very much a red line, and it's a difficult issue, and it extends itself even though there are civil aspects to this, even though we're talking about secular law. Again, a question of relationships, civil unions, I think is a very interesting one. I think it's one that, again, I don't know where people would come out on it, but I think it's a conversation that had you raised 10 and 15 years ago, people would have been vehemently opposed, and today you would find a different reception to having that conversation.
Tell us just a little bit about the OU's position on gay marriage. It opposes it, obviously, on the halakhic grounds that you talked about. Are there other arguments that it makes in the resolution? In other words, if you were going to Congress to argue against gay marriage, what would be the argument that you would make?
Well, one thing, and again, in the resolution, it refers to directly or indirectly supporting gay marriage. At the time it was crafted, there was a feeling that they're very much, and I think it goes back to the very point that people were seeing this as a dilution of what Orthodox Jews understood to be an ethical standard, and therefore the resolution says direct or indirectly support. So I think it's a very strong resolution. Again, no one in the organization has said that they're going to revisit that resolution. There have been people who've suggested that maybe we ought to bring up that topic. This is, to my mind, very much an evolving issue, but it's a difficult issue, and it comes up all the time. I mean, where you're seeing it discussed in the Orthodox community a lot. I speak to many rabbis, congregational and pulpit rabbis, who are grappling with this issue. They're counseling people who are dealing with issues that are attendant to people who are gay in the community. They're dealing with, do they come to shul? They're dealing with reparative therapy questions and all things of that nature. These are constant questions, and it's evolving.
Again, just let me try once more. In the resolution, what is the argument of why gay marriage should be opposed? Is it God said so, or is it something, are you going to a senator or a congressperson or a state legislator to argue why it shouldn't be passed? What is the nature of the argument that you make?
I don't remember the particular resolution, but if you're asking, it goes exactly to the point I said before, which is, understanding that there was a certain ethical standard and norm, which was the status quo, and we see it as being there. In particular, I think perhaps an issue that is important to understand, the distinction is that you both referred to it, and I'm not contesting that, referred to it as a human right, as a civil right, but I think it's an important point that in the Orthodox, in many segments of the Orthodox Jewish community, I think what you have is the fact that people feel strongly and want a freedom and want a right does not make it a human rights issue, and it's a difficult thing to say, but it is the case. And so I think what constitutes a civil right or a human right is a different conception.
But the right to marry is a fundamental human right that's recognized here. Everyone has that right. The question is, are you going to restrict who they can marry? That's the issue. But the right to marriage is clearly a universally under international law recognized fundamental human right and a key civil right under our legal doctrine here in America. Still not sure. The ethical norm that's being violated, other than God said that this is a sin, what is the ethical norm that you would assert to a non-Jewish a member of a state legislature that is being violated by their voting for civil recognition of marriage for people who are gays and lesbians?
Again, I'm not asserting an ethical, an underlying. All I was pointing out is that this is something that has its origins in a religious ethical finding. The same way I reference sanctity of life, but you have it also that I think religious.
If the only argument one can make is purely a religious argument, again, you have a right to do it, but it puts me back, in the democratic free marketplace of ideas. But then it does really raise establishment questions if one cannot give a secular justification for a law. It's really hard for me to think it's certainly not hurting our marriages, not going to hurt any of your marriages to recognize it. It's not infringing upon anyone else's civil rights or civil liberties to do it. There are under the First Amendment, can't force churches or synagogues or mosques that have objections to it to engage in it in sanctioning such marriages. Not sure what the argument is about why not accept the notion of a civil right in the form of marriage for people to be able to live out their lives with the same rights and opportunities that others have. So again, I understand why you have such strong objections to it. I understand why the OU has such strong objections. But if we're talking only about the civil right that's involved here, I'm not sure why they rose to the level where you felt this had to be vetoed or you would walk from the organization here rather than for allow the kind of dissent that you discussed before. But in the end, I defend your right to take the position you do.
And I appreciate that. But I think there are other arguments which have been made. And again, I don't recall the specific text of the resolution, but when we've spoken out, there are arguments that relate to the broader concept of a family structure and a sanctity of marriage, which are slightly different arguments. And I know that those have been...
Is the OU's position that a marriage cannot be as good a marriage between two women, two men, as with a man and a woman?
The OU has taken the position in the past, or officers of the OU have taken the position that there is something that's unique to the family structure that was traditional. Whether they've analyzed and studied all the other forms, I don't know. In other words, I do think that there is, like I said, there comes a point in time that I think the strictly religious argument doesn't necessarily have its place. And I think at some point, absent simply putting a stake in the ground, but I think you don't see us out in, at least not in very recent times, advocating against and making that argument, because I think there is a shift. And again, that doesn't reflect an official policy change, but in other words, there's this evolution and a balance, and I think you're seeing changes in how we address it. And to my mind, there's a period of time when you have these things with, really, I consider it some religious basis, that's, religious bias basis, something like that, historically. Mm-hmm. As society moves away from it, that argument perhaps has less place in legislatures and things like that, and I think you're seeing less strident advocacy from the community.
Jeremy?
I guess I want to, again, move back from this is about the OU and the JCPA to being about the JCPA, and maybe the question for the OU, but really the question for all the organizations represented in this room is, why do we sit at this table? We sit at this table together to be one family, to have a common voice on some set of issues. Some would say they're the most important issues of the time or the consensus issues of the time. Some would say we sit at this table to take positions on every issue of the time. However you see it, we're all making choices to be at that table. Now, it's not just because we can have a united voice on Israel. We have other tables for that. We have AIPAC for that. We have other places to be a united voice on the U.S.-Israel relationship. So this is a different table. This is a table that is about some broader building a consensus and building a voice of the organized Jewish community on a broad range of issues. If we value that, if we all value that, if we value moving beyond our own individual organizations and community spaces on finding consensus, then how do we move beyond having a back and forth about what is halacha and whether or not the argument of any one organization is coming from a halachic or a Jewish biblical point of view, and let's face it, all the denominations in this room do come at this and many other issues from the moral voice of what Torah guides the denominations to take on public issues. So there's a different construct of halacha and Torah in different denominations. But if we're all doing that, we ultimately come to something, a public voice of an organized Jewish community that is bigger than one denomination or one interpretation of Torah. And it is about a range of our interests, our commonly held priorities. What does it mean for us if we profess to speak for the American Jewish community, and the American Jewish community overwhelmingly supports this, and we are silent? And what does it mean for us in our partnerships with other communities that on the most pressing civil rights issue of the time, we are silent? And what does it mean for us, frankly, even when we're doing other work, speaking out and being proud about what's going on in Israel in terms of LGBT rights, that we're unable to take this step as a community here? These are challenges that we have to ask ourselves about why we choose to stay at this table collectively.
And something that does bind us together is that the Jewish tradition is more than just halakha. And in particularly when we're applying Jewish values and Jewish tradition to a non-Jewish, a non-halakhic society. There are meta values in our tradition that the rabbis tell us are universal values applying to all human beings in all human societies that include the fundamental dignity of every person, the basic equality of all people derived from the Agadic questions, why we all descended from one couple, was Adam made from the dust of the four corners and colors of the earth, the notion of freedom of choice being at the core of the human condition, which applied in a secular civil society like America, resonates deeply with an argument about the full equality of gays and lesbians. And good people can differ over it, but there is a powerful Jewish argument to be made, not just in terms of nuances of the halakha, but in the broader sense, particularly with a non-halakhic, non-Jewish society like America. Let me just pose a specific question, if I may here. The Supreme Court is going to come down with a decision. Hypothetically, if it should come down with a decision saying that this is a fundamental civil right, and then the question is going to be over implementation of it and nuances it and efforts to check it, et cetera. What is your feeling based on the conversations you had about how the OU will then respond to JCPA's effort to get involved into supporting a clear implementation of the Supreme Court's decision in local laws and state laws and the federal government as well? Will the same concerns arise then, or will that change the landscape in a way that would make it more comfortable, even if you dissented on something for JCPA to move?
It's an interesting question, and again, I'm speaking very personally here, not organizationally. There is definitely an argument that if there is an established right in U.S. law to gay marriage, and that's there and established, I could see that as being a different circumstance than today, where, again, I talked about this balancing consideration, and it's very important to us that we not be in a position where we feel that we are supporting or developing something that will result in something we see as problematic. But if it exists and is there, we're not opposed to. I think we're very sensitive to the rights and dignities of people, and if the issue that we have ethical, or I should say halachic issue with, is gone, and the question is simply, should you discriminate against people? I think it would be a very different circumstance and would be looked at very differently.
Okay. Are you willing to take questions from the audience?
Can I just say one thing, which is, to Jeremy's point about stepping back a bit from this particular issue, and I think the goal here was to speak a little bit about consensus. I would just point to something which I actually, in my tenure at the OU, have pointed to as one of my more rewarding interactions. I'm not sure others engaged in the same interaction would have the same view, but I hope so. About a year ago, when there was the issues in Beit Shemesh, and the stories of a young girl on her way to school being spat upon and other indignities. And at that time, the National Council of Jewish Women had proposed a resolution that got sent to us for review. And I think it was a resolution we had real issue with. in some of its characterizations, and there was a lot of discussion. I think it was shared with us partially because they were concerned that we would have issues with it. And there were some within our own organization who felt that, we're wasting our time to engage on this issue. And I think we engaged for a number of months. And through that level of dialogue, we very quickly came to realize that there wasn't all that much that divided us. And in fact, at some point we realized we had exactly the same views. The concerns were how to express it. The particular case was, I think everyone acknowledged, we used the example of a segregated swimming pool. If there's a municipal swimming pool in the midst of a Haredi neighborhood, that might be appropriate to have separate hours. Everyone agreed on that concept. The question was, if you simply say appropriate accommodation, the argument was that's been the status quo for 20 years, and you could drive a segregated bus right through that. So the question was, how do you phrase this? And we went on, this went back and forth for a number of months, and I think at the end of the day, we produced a resolution jointly that not only did we not veto, dissent, vote against, we voted for, and there was a serious discussion about us co-sponsoring the resolution. For technical and strategic reasons it didn't happen, but in other words, from an organizational willingness, it was there. And I think that's important because that's really what this conversation is about, as much as there are, and I think there are very few, I don't know any other issue like the issue of gay marriage in terms, and again, we can wonder why there is some element of that red line I mentioned, but most issues, I think there's so much that could happen and so much conversations that's beneficial to everyone that, I was very, very pleased with that interaction. I think it produced a result we could all be happy with, and it demonstrated, to me at least, the value of our belonging to the JCPA, of the process of religious movements having a veto, which in turn, lets there be conversation because, absent that, I think that there are strong majorities and a certain, I think that this, JCRCs and JCPA at some level tend to be populated with more liberal folks, and we were very happy with that.
Thank you. Just so in case we have one or two questions, because we need to move on, if you could identify yourself at the microphone, please, and ask a succinct question.
Okay. My name is Susan Turnbull. I'm a vice chair of JCPA and chair of Jewish Women International. I was on some of the conversations about this resolution, and I think that many of us sitting in this room right now feel like, ew. I mean, that's sort of pained by this discussion. I'd like to bring it back to Jeremy's comments about how do we get from here to the next place? How do we get from here to the next place when I know in our state, and I know I'm doing what we don't want people to do is make statements, but I want to give a fact. The state of Maryland and our JCRC supported marriage equality in November of 2012. Montgomery County, which is the bulk of the Jewish community, voted 72% for marriage equality. In the 3 precincts where you could really determine an Orthodox Jewish population, the vote was about 68, 71, and 69%. It is an overwhelming majority. How do we deal with consensus about a civil marriage when we can't, when we are at this point right now?
Thank you, Susan. If we can take a few questions again quickly.
Well, and again, I'm going to Ayala Golding from Louisville, and one of the drafters of the resolution from Louisville. And I do want to clarify a couple points. While our resolution mentioned gay marriage, our resolution was about civil marriage. And the conversation today was about the OU's opposition to gay marriage. I also will say that when we drafted it, we did seek the input of the OU. I did contact, I know David Lukens is behind me, so I did have a communication with David Lukens. And I think we were talking about civility and family, that we're all a part of a family. Marie opened up that we're a part of a family. I think we were somewhat of a dysfunctional family on this issue because I didn't get a lot of feedback. And my communication from David from the get-go was that the OU did not want to veto this. They did not want to come to the point of veto. And I think that,
got this.
I just want to say one point. If we would have been correctly informed, and maybe if the OU would have been correctly informed as to how this goes, this wouldn't be, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation, but it wouldn't have happened because we also would have been respectful of the OU in not confronting the issue and waiting the time. But I do want to clarify, this is not an issue of gay
Got it.
marriage. It is an issue of civil marriage, and that
Thank you.
conversation
So
has to be continued.
clarification and communication, please, quickly.
Richard Fulton from the American Jewish Committee. Even for those of us that are strong supporters of marriage equality, there's been a concern that if and hopefully when marriage equality is recognized, that there will be implications for religious liberty, for the ability of religious institutions to operate within their religious norms. It's clear that no clergy person will be required to officiate at a marriage that they, for religious reasons, cannot perform, but there are going to be other tertiary issues. To what extent do those concerns play out? This is a question for Mr. Neuberger. Have those concerns played out as part of the reason for the position that the OU has taken, or has that not been a factor? And anyone else who wants to comment on how that issue is likely to play out and what we ought to be doing to safeguard religious liberty,
Thank you.
I'd also welcome that.
Okay, tertiary issues, communication, process forward, please.
Doug Kahn, San Francisco, a community that obviously has a strong interest in this subject. So thank you for at least having this wonderful panel. It's astonishing how quickly attitudes are changing on this subject. 2 weeks ago, there was a new statewide poll in California, the state that gave us Proposition 8. 61% said they now favor same-sex civil marriage, 32% oppose. Just astonishing how quickly this train is moving. My question's for David Saperstein. David, I'm wondering, based on what Jeremy said about this being the civil rights movement of our time, looking back to the civil rights movement of the 60s, thinking about how it was initially a little bit difficult to move forward from the perspective of the national Jewish community because of sensitivities around some of the smaller southern Jewish communities that were quietly supportive of desegregation and ending the Jim Crow laws, but were nervous about the public stance of the national Jewish community. Anything we can learn from that period to help us garner the support nationally through organizations such as JCPA?
Okay, historical background. 2 more questions.
Jim Rosenstein, Philadelphia. I'm trying to understand the difference between the perspective of the OU from a universalistic versus a particularistic perspective. So my question is, to the extent you know the answer, does the OU oppose civil marriage between non-Jewish same-sex individuals, or only oppose civil marriage between Jewish individuals?
Thank you. Please.
David Lukens, Orthodox Union. I usually have something glib to say. I have nothing glib to say. I'm very depressed. I am deeply depressed, and with your permission, Professor Levine, I'd like to say why I'm depressed. I'm depressed because this was supposed to be a discussion on consensus. Instead, I had a sense up there for a little while that my friend Yehuda Neuberger, who's been involved with the Orthodox Union for exactly 2 years now, was being held responsible for all the crimes and sins of the last 2,000 years. Let me just, as briefly as I can, I cast the last religious veto in the JCPA. It was in 1988. The question was over whether there should be a housing march on Shabbat. And everyone wanted to support the housing march. There was a firestorm when I cast that veto. And David Saperstein got up and said, any religious group can cast a veto for anything they believe deeply in. But we don't want to cast this veto. This is a veto. I had said within the OU circles that I would resign from the JCPA as a delegate before I cast this veto. This veto would be so painful to those members of our community who are lesbians and gays, who are transsexual, it would be so painful to them. It would be the wrong thing. You see, everyone, the question Judah was asking, we don't sit around at OU meetings day and night debating the nuances of this issue. America's changing, folks. America's changing. And our major concern right now, if I can speak ex cathedra, I believe, is to protect our community in particular issues and areas where we may find our synagogues, our day schools, having problems because of this. But let's be very, very candid now. This is not the first issue that's been like this in the JCPA. There was a far greater firestorm between 1988 and 1993 on the issue of who was a Jew. A far greater firestorm. A much greater firestorm. And the fact is, this organization has never taken a position on who is a Jew. Because the minute we did, we'd have to walk out, guys. And that's why we did the same thing we went through. There was a lot more anger and fury in the room then than there is now. And I believe Gamze Yavor, and I think that this the civility, and I think the consensus, I think the way we work together is going to carry the day once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Lukens. Final comment.
Yes,
I am
my
not
name-
now, I've never been a rabbi. Now that's fighting words.
Fair enough.
Rabbi Levine.
Fair enough.
My name is Maxine Richmond, and I'm from the Rhode Island CRC. I'd like to share with you 5 short sentences from a statement of the Board of Rabbis of Greater Rhode Island, and then I have a question. Our
Could we
legislature...
just go directly to the question, because we really are short of time? Is that possible?
I would love if I could just share 2 sentences then.
How about do 2 out of 5?
My comment that I want to say, so then I can ask a question, is the Board of Rabbis of Greater Rhode Island is supporting marriage equality in Rhode Island. And their support comes for same-sex marriage on 2 principles, and they represent different movements and practices, including all practices of Judaism. The first lesson from Jewish history provides us with a mandate to work for civil rights. Second is the clear distinction American law makes between civil and religious marriages. As rabbis, we believe that every human being is created in the image of God. That is our obligation to defend vigorously the dignity of and respect for every human being and every loving couple. Now, it's a much greater statement. I'll share it with anybody. And my question to you, on behalf of our CRC and the Greater Rhode Island community, and a passionate social justice person, and a mother of a gay son, is what is the plan for our JCPA to come to consensus so that we can show our LGBT Jewish people that they are equal in American civil society? Thank you.
Thank you. In the limited time that we have, well, I got, Marie, 4 minutes? 5 minutes. The major question seems to be, how do we move forward from this? So far we have had, I thought, in fact, an enormously respectful discussion within which we want everyone to understand what other people are thinking and how the process works. So in that spirit of respect and shalom, where do we go from here? Start with David.
Very quickly on the civil rights movement, there was some hesitancy of groups to be overtly public in the very beginning, but really by the mid-1950s, NACRAC at that time was able to take a position, and Arnie Aronson was one of the 3 founders of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. So we kind of resolved the issue. It was more about the way we talked about it than it was whether or not we would take a public issue out of respect for those groups, Doug. So, I mean, I think there are insights. Look, every page of the Talmud is filled with majority and minority opinions. But in general, the next words were not take, or the next words were not, we're going to resolve this down the road. In order to function, the community reached decisions and made decisions of how to move forward, which represented a consensus, even if they were very thoughtful rabbis who held strong principled position to the contrary. I hope we can find a way to do that. But I just want to defend the principle of the veto here. You know, in the Washington and Jerusalem, the heads, the coalition of heads of all the religious groups, 35 years ago when we founded it, we said we weren't going to deal with Israel and we weren't going to deal with abortion. On those, because it was more important to keep the broad coalition together on the 95% of the issues that we could work together than it was to tear it apart. And they really felt people felt we would have to leave on principle if people took something diametrically opposed on one side or the other of those issues. I don't want to lose the Orthodox community. Another forum for another time is, love to see the Orthodox Union more robustly engaged on the broad agenda of JCPA, where often we could use their voice on the issues where we do disagree, where we do agree on. But I really think it's important that we be respectful of this. My only bottom line point is that I really think that the ability to distinguish between this as a civil issue, and Jeremy, I thought, was quite eloquent about that, and so were many of the questioners, as a civil issue, here is one that we should be able to live with. And even if the OU dissents, I hope we can move forward. I would also flag at some point with ENDA coming down the road, Employment Non-Discrimination Act, if we have a robust religious exemption, it would be great if that's clearly a civil issue with the religious exemption. It would be great to have the OU support for that as well.
Sure.
I want to reiterate again that the primacy of keeping this table on the things that we can agree on. That is a core principle for any CRC director and for any community that puts a focus on where we have consensus being the most powerful voice we can be. That is the spirit in which we chose not to move forward with pushing a civil marriage equality resolution here. I hope that is the spirit of this conversation. I would say the road forward for JCPA, there are two factors here. One, and we haven't really talked about it, let's be honest, in the public eye, in the debate in Washington, nobody thinks the Jewish community is not there on this issue. The JCPA is not the sole voice, and the fact that the reform movement, ADL, Hadassah, NCJW, CRCs, there are plenty of us, 1,600 rabbis through Trua, that have signed on to various amica at the Supreme Court. Nobody's sitting around saying the Jews aren't with us on this issue. This is about what JCPA is about, not about what the Jews are about. And for JCPA, if we truly strive to be speaking on all the issues of our time, this is a challenge that we have to continue to grapple with. And I would suggest for the task force, in a similar way to what we did in Boston, I would invite those in this room, and I don't think it's fair to say it's only the Orthodox Union as an organization that do not support civil marriage equality yet, to take responsibility for writing a draft resolution. Let those in this room who were not prepared to vote tonight for a civil marriage equality resolution to step forward after the session, come to the task force, I guess talk to Ethan, and say we will take responsibility for drafting one or more resolutions that either take a particular piece of it, like DOMA or ENDA, or a more broad scope approach to it, and say this is what we could not walk away from the table if it were to pass. Take that responsibility for the community. Be invested in the collective in that way.
Thank you. Yehuda?
Okay. So just first, as one comment is, I absolutely recognize the distinction between civil and religious marriage and the religious aspects of it. And again, the point that we've raised here today was not a question of whether civil gay marriage is okay. The question was whether the JCPA should be supporting it, which OU has a different view of that, about whether a Jewish organization that it is a member and part of, and a proud member and part of, should be advocating for that. I could repeat the litany that Jeremy referred to. There are many, many Jewish organizations doing it. Is it noticeable that the JCPA's voice is absent? Absolutely. I happen to personally believe that the rationale for that is something that this organization can take great pride in, even if it's not addressing this particular issue. On the question of religious legal protections, in fact, if you look the last number of years, and this is even, I've talked about more recent times shifting, but for a number of years already, our major push in responding to gay marriage legislation was much more on the religious protection than it was on arguing against the act per se. In terms of ways to go forward, you referenced ENDA. ENDA is something that we've I believe, been neutral on, but surely haven't objected to. I think as things shift within our own community, I think that there are areas, even within this topic, that we can work together. To get to the point that, you mentioned that the Boston JCRC wanted to veto the resolution because it should say gay marriage. I don't think we can get to the point that we will not get to that point where people are looking for that, but I think that there are interim steps, and I think that, in my conversations with Rabbi Guttal and with Ethan, we spoke about the fact that it is worthwhile to get together and engage in conversation to understand, are there areas where we can work together. I think it's important to state that we're sensitive to the issue, we're sensitive to the people, we understand that we're dealing with people's dignities and rights. We see religious issue with it. We will do our best always to make sure that within the confines of what we believe to be a religious imperative, we will do the most we can to be sensitive and careful. I welcome the opportunity for us to continue to engage with the JCPA and others within its realm to discuss this issue and see if there are in fact areas where we can work together.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You were great.